do that. Okay. This is a practice presentation from Karthik, who will be speaking at his departmental seminar on Thursday. So if you're here or if you are watching the recorded version, please be sure to send Karthik comments and they will be most useful in the next day or two.
Yep.
Go ahead,
Sounds
Karthik.
good. Yeah, and I think for today, I wouldn't want to time it. It's supposed to be for 20 minutes, but I think for today you can just stop me at any point because I might be talking nonsense. So
So
yeah,
I can time it. And do you want any warnings during this?
no, I think it's okay. We can just time it just to see where I'll be, but I'm not too worried at this point about 20 minutes. One more feedback and just to get a sense for how people think about this.
Well, you may begin now.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so just a warning that there's like so many theories and frameworks that I'll be talking about. I might just spend, I don't know, 5 or 10 seconds on each of them, while in reality they probably warrant 15 books or something. So just to keep that in mind before I sort of start talking about this. So yeah, so what I'll do is I'll give a brief sort of history of how people have been thinking about well-being, what's missing, how we fit in, what we are trying to do in this sort of well-being space. So things start all the way if you go back to about 300 BC with Aristotle talking about his ideas of human flourishment and how you should not be just limited to feeling happy or having material possessions, but you should think about your holistic happiness in some sense and have multi-dimensional view on how your life is going on. So this is at 300 BC, and then in some ways humanity lost track of this idea up until the 1980s. So I would characterize the period in between to be mostly dominated by ideas of utility or opulence, where the mainstream thinking was mostly dominated upon ideas of material possessions and then economic growth and things like that, until the 80s, where Amartya Sen came up with his capabilities framework, which emphasized more on the agency of human beings rather than economic metrics. So his framework was focused on removing obstacles in people's lives so that they can achieve whatever they want to. So for example, this could be providing them with enough education, health, and things like that so that they have the freedom to choose whatever life goals they have. But this is more of a theory, and then by definition, Sen did not provide any definite lists. He wanted the list to come out of a democratic process rather than him prescribing anything. And this was sort of slightly modified upon or built upon by Martha Nussbaum, who actually came up with a definite list of indicators that she recommended people can draw upon, build upon. So these included things, not just things like access to electricity and all of that, but also political freedom, democratic systems, freedom to think for yourself, and all of that. But then Sen didn't really want to do this because he felt putting a list out there would be very restrictive and sort of paternalistic in some way. And the most famous one after this came from The Pursuit of Happiness, which I guess a lot more people are familiar with. But then, this got canceled like a couple of years ago, so let's not talk about that. And a bigger sort of change or more nuts and bolts to this capabilities series were added by Ingrid Robbins in the 2000s, where she sort of mixed the approaches from Nussbaum and Sen and said, well, I'm going to define a democratic process by which you could actually come up with a list of capabilities that policymakers could use. And she also introduced the ideas of limitarianism, so sort of putting a cap on how much is enough to be sort of well. And during the same time, all of this discussion was sort of happening in the philosophy-ish, economic philosophy world. So there's a lot of work happening simultaneously in the field of ecological economics. So people like Tim Jackson, who started thinking about sustainability, again, in the frame of well-being. So sustainability sort of entered this conversation of well-being as well. And finally, sort of putting all of this together is where we are trying to sort of encompass all of these ideas of well-being, limits to well-being, sustainability, and in the context of climate change and energy. So that's sort of a brief history of how I've been thinking about this. And I'll sort of dig into these frameworks a little more to see what they actually mean and how we could implement them from a quantitative perspective rather than a theoretical discussion. So again, this is very simplified way of thinking about things, but traditional economics, you could think of measures like looking at expenditures or macro metrics of GDP growth or income growth, and then connect them to poverty alleviation. So this is perhaps the most dominant thinking in mainstream policy making. And another approach that we are more familiar with, at least I'm more familiar with, is the subjective well-being approach, where you directly ask people how they're feeling about themselves. So we've seen this before, ideas of hedonic well-being, evaluative well-being, or eudaimonic well-being. And again, in the subjective well-being approach as well, no single indicator can tell you how people are doing well. So depending on the context, you could mix things together to come up with a better well-being indicator. So you could think about life satisfaction plus happiness, or life satisfaction plus stress, and things like that. And finally, the capabilities approach sort of takes a step back in some sense. So it does encompass both of these two ideas of subjective well-being and the traditional economics in some way, but focuses more on the functioning of humans. So let me just give you an example. So for example, think about the idea of using your bike to get somewhere. So you start off with, well, first getting a bike. So that is a commodity, which would be a traditional economic metric. And then the purpose you want a bike is for transportation, and this could be influenced by a lot of personal and social factors in your life. And then the function that you actually need to use this bike is being able to cycle around. So that is what Sain wants us to focus on. He wants us to focus on empowering people so that they have the capability to bike, which would ultimately give them happiness. But the focus is more on functioning rather than the utility of either happiness or having the bike. So those are the broad frameworks of how these three different fields are thinking about well-being. I'll dig a little more deeper into each of these to see what the limitations are for each of them and how we could maybe bring all of these together into the same conversation. So I'll just start with the top, which is the more traditional income-based metrics of, let's say, looking at household incomes, expenditures, setting poverty thresholds based on, being some percent below the median income and things like that. And usually the challenge with these metrics is that they don't capture inequality well, and they don't really capture how well the poor are doing. So those are usually the two reasons to sort of discount just income-based metrics and use other metrics. And for subjective metrics such as satisfaction, happiness, and stress, well, the good thing is you're directly asking people how they feel about themselves and how they feel about how their life is doing. But sort of the criticism of this is mostly due to adaptive preferences. And this is one of the biggest reasons why also Sain rejected these subjective-based approaches because he saw that, for example, people like the hopeless beggar, or in his work, he saw that housewives are conditioned in a certain way and they might still be satisfied with their lives, but in reality, they've just adapted to poorer life conditions. So that is the reason why there's some rejection of these subjective-based indicators and to look more closely at these capability ones. So capability ones, there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen here to come up with the list. I think, Tammy, I saw your previous point of how to get to this democratic process. So yeah, so as I previously, Shane just said, this is the general thinking framework, and you have to come up with your own list of indicators that you think are most applicable. And that is how the Human Development Index came into being, because the policymakers in the US thought, okay, this health, education, shelter, maybe electricity, which make the most sense. But Shane did not endorse any of these things. He just said, that's your problem, not my problem as a theory person. So, and the criticism with the capabilities framework is also, one is there's a question of freedom. There's a criticism that it is very individualistic and doesn't really talk about how much freedom is enough freedom, what are the limits to this. And also similar argument about adaptation can be made to the capabilities framework as well when you get to the democratic process, because there again, you have power group dynamics, you have how do you come up with a list. Again, there people are used to certain things, so you fall into the same trap of adaptation there as well. So what I was sort of thinking is, well, we need to come up with something that captures people's needs deprivation, but it also has to be some sort of a compromise between us being paternalistic and suggesting a bunch of indicators and not going all the way down and making a democratic decision as to what this list can be. So how do we achieve that middle ground where we identify something, but also make sure that this is what people want in some sense? So where is that middle ground? Okay, so if we dig deeper into literature just to understand the ideas of subjective well-being poverty, income poverty, and capabilities poverty. So the first chunk is subjective well-being poverty versus income poverty. So there's a lot of what you call positive psychology literature looking at life satisfaction and income. And what typically happens in these is income is significantly and positively correlated to subjective well-being, but the R-square values are very, very low. And usually you have to add in things like gender, race, health, and that will prop up the R-square values to more, 0.5, 0.6, suggesting that subjective well-being encompasses income poverty, but subjective well-being is much more than just income. So yeah, that is one of the examples shown here where you can see that the R-square values are, pretty low. Similarly, there have been other works looking at subjective well-being poverty versus capabilities poverty. So here you'd look at, again, life satisfaction versus capabilities in the sense of education. So those are the variables shown below here, and having piped infrastructure, having a roof over your head, having access to public transportation and things like that. And what seems to be the general consensus is that, yes, subjective well-being is encompassing both income poverty and capabilities to some extent. But what this sort of misses out again is going back to the question of what people actually want versus what we think people might want. So my idea was to look at deprivations, but from the way people feel about them, rather than looking at completely objective metrics. So we will look at objective metrics as well, just to keep that in the loop. But based on what's missing out there, it seems like how people feel about them not having access to needs also needs to be included in this discussion. So yeah, so that sort of sets the stage for what I'm trying to look at in this presentation. So what is the subjective well-being cost of not having these basic needs? So that's the overarching question. And so the sub-questions underneath this would be, well, are some needs more essential than other needs? And two, who are the people most affected by these, by not having access to certain needs? And the third question is, I won't get to it completely because it's a whole different discussion. I'll show some initial results in this area, but how much is enough? Like you get people out of their deprivations, but then where do you draw the line as this is enough? So that's a different discussion, but I'll show you some interesting results we've been getting there. So yeah, so the way we are dealing with this is, yes, we've built this huge data set, which has metrics coming from different surveys in the US. So we have energy metrics, housing related metrics, just expenditure metrics, transportation, and then just general well-being. So again, each of these surveys have hundreds of variables sitting in there, and the first goal was to identify or create variables that would capture the ideas we've been thinking about of well-being and deprivation. So the way I did this is here. So in the area of subjective well-being, I chose, again, all of these lists are not exhaustive, so we can always add, but I just sort of just drew the line here. So yeah, so for subjective well-being, I chose life satisfaction, which is a number from 1 to 10. And another mental well-being metric is stress. This is just a question of whether you were stressed yesterday or not. And the third question is sort of very interesting. It sort of lies in the area between the capabilities and subjective frameworks, which is the capabilities question. And the exact question is, do you think you have all the capabilities you need to work or to perform to get all the things you want in life? So which is somewhere in between these two approaches. And then for the traditional metrics, we have total expenditures, and there's poverty thresholds. In the US, the census defines a couple of metrics. So I'll talk about them when we get to that. And then we have an expenditures for each of these 4 categories. And to think about the basic needs approach, so objectively, we've defined 4 indicators. So one is time to get to grocery stores. For the food metric, for energy, it's the number of disconnection days you've had. And for housing insecurity, I've developed a housing quality index. And then for travel, I've looked at waiting times that people usually spend every day just waiting for public transportation options. And subjectively, so we just have similar indicators for energy, food, housing, and travel. I'll get into the definitions on the next slide. And there are other factors like personal and geographic factors that are usually not discussed, at least when you're thinking about in like economic sense. So things like race or where you live or whether you own a house, you're renting a house, all of these do influence your well-being through different networks. I'll also talk about introducing that heterogeneity into this discussion. Okay, so getting into the results. So first, I look at these subjective basic needs deprivations and how those affect your other subjective well-being indicators. So energy insecurity, the way it's defined is from the EIA definition, and I've added another variable of feeling cold also into this definition. So that all of these are yes or no questions. So this is whether you faced any of these as described in the box here. And food, again, comes directly from the USDA definition, so no modification required there. And housing insecurity, this one's slightly tricky. So I've used this question of how if your house is better or worse than your previous house. But you can also think about housing insecurity of not being able to pay rent, which is probably more common with the housing insecurity community, but we don't really have questions like that. So I just stuck to using this question, but I'm happy to get more feedback on that. And travel is just, do you think travel is a burden to you or not? I'll walk you through this first result here. So what we have on the y-axis here is a life satisfaction. And on the x-axis, we have these 4 different insecurity metrics. And the open circles are the life satisfaction scores of people who said no to these questions. So these are secure households. And at the bottom, the filled circles are the ones who answered yes to these questions. So them being insecure. And we find a large and significant difference in the life satisfaction scores for the secure versus the insecure households, with the energy one being the largest differentiator. So if you look at the difference here, and if you just wanted to quantify this in terms of an economic number, this would be worth about $40,000 on the life satisfaction versus income scale. So you sort of a hand wavy argument, but what this would mean is you have to make 40,000 more in order to compensate for this difference in life satisfaction scores. So similar to life satisfaction, you could also look at the capability score. So this is the question that I talked about before, going from 1 to 5. And again, here we find significant differences between the secure and insecure households, and similarly for stress as well, where we find this has to be flipped, but the secure households are less stressed than the insecure households. So regardless of the type of well-being metric I chose, we see that the basic needs insecurities always lowers your well-being significantly. So the next question is, how do you get out of this, or how do you improve your well-being if you're facing these needs? Maybe you move to a different city, maybe that'll improve your well-being. So here are again the same 4 metrics of energy, food, housing, and travel. And I've broken this down by different MSAs. So looking at Chicago, Dallas, Houston, LA, and New York City. And what we find is that wherever you are in the US, the difference between the have and the have-nots seems to be more or less similar. So if you look at the difference in the open and closed circles, it is not that different, except for maybe housing in New York, where there seems to be an overlap between the people who have housing insecurity and people who do not have housing insecurity. But apart from that, it seems that the metrics we've chosen are probably truly basic in some sense, because they're not really changing too much, even if we slice them by where you live. Okay, so the next way is, how do you change maybe you should spend more in order to get rid of your dissatisfaction when you're facing these insecurities. So one, if you just look at how these insecurities change with your spending behavior, well, of course, they do go down. So travel, energy, food, and housing, all these insecurities go down as you spend more. But interestingly, even if you're in the highest spending bracket, it doesn't go down to 0. So again, so suggesting the limitation of using just expenditure to think about insecurities. And for each of these separately, again, if you think about, for example, the first one, energy insecurity spending, with energy spending, we see a clear difference in the life satisfaction scores of the secure versus insecure, even at extremely high spending. So even you're spending in the highest spending category, there is no overlap between the secure and insecure groups, which sort of suggests that money is not compensating for these lack of services or the decisions you're making. And housing seems interesting because there does seem to be some overlap. So maybe housing can be compensated similar to food at the very high end of the spectrum. Probably food spending can also compensate for insecurity. Travel again seems pretty, it's a clear difference for both of these. So then what I thought was, okay, we see these differences. Can we just come up with a single metric that captures all of these insecurities in the same space? So I started developing this insecurity score. So the score would be just a number going from 0 to 4. So if you have a score of 4, which means you're the worst off and you're facing all of these insecurities. And if you have a score of 0, you're probably the best off because you don't face any of these things. And you could definitely ask a question why we're doing this, weighing all of these equally. You could think of more complicated ways to weigh each of these insecurities, but I didn't want to get into that conversation, so I just did an equal split, but there is no reason why we shouldn't do a more weighted approach. So yeah, so here again, we look at how your life satisfaction scores would change as you belong to each of these insecurity baskets. So I'll just walk through one of them, and others are sort of similar. So if you look at the life satisfaction graph on the far left, so going from top to bottom, so the top is the darkest is 0, which is you don't have any insecurities in your life. And the orange one is a score of 3. So you're facing at least you're facing 3 insecurities in your life. And what we see is that there's a clear difference, regardless of which expenditure decile you're sitting in, between each of these buckets. This again is similar in spirit to what we saw in the previous slide, as through even if you increase your spending, you're not really compensating for the insecurities that you're facing at any expenditure level when it comes to life satisfaction. Maybe the capabilities, there is a little more overlap perhaps, but still the overlap only becomes more significant once you get to people who have scored 3. And the larger error bars here because there are fewer people who face all 3 of them. So that is why you see much larger error bars for the orange group. And similarly for stress, we see that stress goes down generally as you spend more in your life. But again, there's clear differences in as your score increases, you are more stressed, and maybe at the very high expenditure level, there is some compensation, but generally, for most part of the distribution, it doesn't seem to be any overlap. And we could also do this more rigorously, setting up a regression model. So here, what I've done is I've taken the well-being metric and then looking at the 4 insecurity measures, but also a bunch of controls that also include expenditure. So we are controlling for spending behavior as well, and we have other things like gender, house size, race, education, employment, all of those. And then even accounting for all these other controls, we still see that energy insecurity contributes significantly and negatively towards all these well-being metrics. The only sort of blip is housing insecurity, which seems to be very close to 0, but slightly positive for stress. I need to look closely to figure out, why this is happening. So, but other than that, everything else seems to sort of line up with just the descriptive stuff that we've seen previously. Another important thing is, yes, all these controls do matter significantly and perhaps even more than the factors I've shown here. So for example, being employed or having a good marriage or being highly educated contribute more towards the life satisfaction than perhaps income and these basic metrics, but that's not the point of discussion. But we need to just keep that in mind, that the life satisfaction is more than just this. Okay, so all of that so far was just looking at subjective deprivations. The good thing about subjective deprivations is that we can clearly differentiate between the have and the have-nots. So because there's yes and no, and you can clearly see the differences between the yeses and the nos. But when it comes to looking at objective metrics, this one's a little more tricky because it is very difficult to define what is fair. So for example, here we have 4 different objective burden metrics, and they more or less follow the expected pattern. So I'll just walk you through one of them. So for example, wait times. Wait times generally decrease with increasing life satisfaction. So there's a little turnaround towards the higher income that I need to investigate more closely. But for most part, the time you spend waiting decreases as for the higher life satisfaction groups, which does make sense intuitively. But then with these objective metrics, the part I was struggling with is, well, how much is a reasonable wait time? Or, how much is a reasonable time to get to a grocery store? And there is no good way for me to come up with a cutoff. So I started thinking about this slightly differently. I thought, well, okay, we cannot come up with what is good, but can we come up with what is fair? So this is where I started to look at heterogeneity in these numbers. So for example, if I look at time to grocery stores for urban versus rural, we see a clear expected difference. So rural households do spend more time getting to a grocery store as expected because there's less density in rural areas, generally speaking. And this gets really interesting when it starts slicing in other dimensions. So for example, housing quality, we see that owners have much better housing quality than renters for any given life satisfaction. So the way I read this is, so for example, if you had a score of 9, you have a much better house being an owner than a renter. Similarly, for transit wait times and energy insecurity days, this one looks a little more interesting if I sort of slice them by race. And what we see is that for the given same life satisfaction score of, let's say, 9, Black and Latino people spend so much more time waiting than the white households. Similarly, for energy insecurity, we see that Latino households face many more insecurity days for the same given life satisfaction score as well. So now the bigger question also sort of is, well, are these people happy because even when facing higher wait times or disconnections, are they like, because have they adopted to a certain lifestyle or certain coping mechanisms that lets them be happy even when their objective conditions are not as good as their the other races, or maybe they have better social relationships that lets them sort of cope with these longer wait times? Or is it that Black and Latino households maybe can achieve even more life satisfaction if we sort of fix these unfairness, if you want to call that? So far I've just sort of battled with my own data sets and just like looking out there to see what metrics already exist. I've looked at the official poverty measure, which is defined by the census in the 1960s based on the food plans for the house. And they usually adjust that for family compositions. And just to give you a number, for a household of 2 adults and 2 children, the official poverty measure turns out to be around 26K. And then there's also the new supplementary poverty measure, it was defined more recently, where they account for also spending on basic needs such as paying your rent, groceries and things like that. So that's the SPM measure. So for today's talk, I've mostly focused on the OPM because SPM requires a little more playing around with to come up with a number for each household. So I'll just look at the OPM. So what I've done is I've taken my data set and then figured out if each household is below the OPM or above the OPM based on how it's defined here. And then I've done the usual life satisfaction, insecurity, trying to see how well these measures hold up based on our understanding of life satisfaction and basic needs. So it's very interesting results here. So I'll start with the one on the left. So this is on the y-axis, we have the fraction of households who are facing insecurity scores of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the way we've defined it previously. And let's focus on the red one first. So these are the households who are below the poverty threshold. And what we find is that a large number of fraction face at least one security. So let's have a 45% of households below the OPM fall in this category. And then there's about 35% who face two insecurities, and then it drops. So the OPM is sort of good in the sense that it's able to capture this population. What's more interesting is that if you look at the households who are above the OPM, there's a similar, 42, 45% of households who are facing at least one type of insecurity, and these households wouldn't be captured when you set thresholds like the way it is set here. So again, showing sort of the limitation of the OPM in some sense, saying that we are missing out on a lot of people who face some sort of insecurity but are not included in this bucket. So that is just connecting insecurity with income measures. And now what if we bring life satisfaction into this? So now on the y-axis, we have life satisfaction as a function of the insecurity score. And if you're above the poverty threshold, you take a big hit in life satisfaction as you start facing more and more insecurity. So that's the green line here. And below the OPM is more interesting because you still have a drop, but the drop is much, much smaller. Perhaps because if you're below the poverty threshold, you already have other life circumstances that are much more dire. Or it could also be that you've already adapted to a lower standard of living, and adding more misery doesn't really change much. Yeah, there's a lot more to explore here to see how these measures actually perform, but I thought this was sort of an interesting start to think about income versus capabilities versus subjective well-being. So yeah, just to conclude, some key ideas or results that we have here. One is, sort of building this data set. I think that took up quite some time. And then we sort of established empirical relationships between income-based metrics, subjective well-being, and then material deprivations coming from sort of the capabilities, basic needs approach. And we also looked at few mediating factors: race, expenditure, tenure, geography, and perhaps some adaptation issues that come into this. And from a policy implications perspective, I think we saw how the thresholds don't really capture the deprivations that people are facing. And then we can also see how you could probably implement more fairer measures to target heterogeneity in race or tenure, for example. I'll just leave you with one final idea that I've also been working on, which is another conversation. But yeah, this idea of how much is enough. And especially, I've just focused on New York for this example, but in theory, we could do this anywhere. So yeah, so how much is enough to be happy? So what I've done here is just put together a map of the most satisfied people. So these are households who've answered 10 on the life satisfaction question. So one, we can sort of locate where a good chunk of these people are. So definitely, so this is a map of greater New York area. So this is the Manhattan region, and these are sort of the MSA parts of Connecticut in the north and New Jersey here. And then we do see that a lot of the happier people are perhaps residing in the suburbs and not much in the Manhattan area. But the question is, what are there some lifestyle choices, or is there some common underlying theme that defines these happy people? So what I've done is taken the set of happy people and sort of tried to cluster them into various lifestyle choices. So each of the box plots here represents a certain lifestyle. So this is still preliminary results. I wouldn't put too much into what exactly is sitting in this lifestyle. So for example, it could be owners with no children in a small house, for example. So that would be categorized as one lifestyle. But the bigger takeaway is that if you look at the energy consumption for each of these lifestyles, they range from 7 megawatt per capita to about 20 megawatt hour per capita for the same most satisfied group of people, suggesting that there are certain lifestyles where you could consume less and still perhaps have the same life satisfaction as the people who are consuming more. So this is preliminary in some sense. We're still thinking about how to formulate this, but yeah, this would sort of close the loop as to we looked at the poorer part of the distribution, and this would probably go on the other end, looking at the limits of household needs. So I'll just sort of leave you with this slide just to show you how we are thinking about these different metrics and how we are putting this picture together. And yeah, I think I'll just stop here and then I'll see if I can address the chat. But yeah, that is the presentation for now. Oh, thank you.
So Karthik, that was 42 minutes.
Oh, okay. Now
That's the first thing to work on.
okay, let me just go through the chat to see if I was not paying too much attention.
No, I don't think you should pay attention.
Yeah,
I think it was good.
there's too much there right now. You should take a look at it later.
Yeah, I saved it off and I'll send it to you. So,
Okay.
and I was hoping that you wouldn't pay a lot of attention to the chat and disrupt your flow and timing.
Mhm.
I think you need to, given that you're double time right now, I think you
Mhm.
need to pick out a thread, decide which thread you want to communicate clearly. And I know you think you have a thread, but you need you've got like 2 or 3 threads braided together and you need to pick out like one of them.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. I think Nasima, you're saying something.
No, I mean, I can go through some of the slides with you bilaterally. I think the upfront framing is really useful, but it needs to be considerably shorter, and you can avoid some landmines, in terms of how you characterize certain things. But the basic idea that you have, income and consumption, and then you have basic capabilities, and then you have what people think of their own lives, right?
Mhm.
And like I think you can put them on a continuum. You can actually relate them in many different ways.
Mhm.
I mean, you can think of it as the ultimate goal being capabilities, basic needs satisfier, kind of an interim, and income is even further removed, but it's still intended to be a means to an end. and that people
Mhm.
understand that,
Right.
So it's like when you present a framing that can be very controversial, it puts off a lot of the audience if they feel differently. And I don't
Right.
think that is necessary to show a lot of the results. It's very valid to put measures of these different frames and look at them together without
Mhm.
needing to frame it a certain way, And so,
Mm.
yeah, I think you really need to simplify. I would almost start with that Venn diagram and talk about there being different sets of indicators and frames for how we think about well-being that are all coexisting in our world of research. And
Mhm.
some are ends. You can say the capabilities are ultimately an end everybody understands, but it's just really hard to operationalize. And in the other
Mhm.
extreme, you have income that everybody knows is important, but it just doesn't tell you enough about how it confers any well-being. And the
Mhm.
basic needs indicators are kind of in between. They're instrumental, they're satisfiers, but they fail on both ends. They're as means as well
Mhm.
as ends.
Right.
And
Right.
then that is enough to me to just frame and characterize, and then say that none of these things have been looked at together.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
what you're doing for the first time using a unique data set. And it's an initial exploration empirically of these relationships to explore, what they might tell us about how the means we provide to people lead to the ends we ultimately want for them. You know,
Mhm.
and we just don't know. There's a whole world of empirics that just are not placed in the context of theories.
Right.
And your
Right.
data exploration allows you to do that, to start doing that. And you can be very modest about what you're trying to do, but it's literally the first time this is being done.
Mhm.
And then I would just spend so much more time on the data, you know.
Mm.
Anyway, that's all I'll say now. I have a lot of details, specific things like the choice of the housing security. I think maybe, yeah, we looked at the various different ones. Um, I thought there was an option to look at something else that was in binary form, like from the AHS, because I'm not sure I like the one that you chose. But anyway, we can talk about that
Yeah.
later. I want to let others, Christina may also have comments and Zara as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think it was a very good presentation. And I'm coming from a background without, like, I'm not very familiar with the well-being frameworks and so on. So I think what would be helpful for someone like me is to show in the beginning or focus more clearly on how, like, why it matters to look at the well-being in, like, kind of policy implications, or like, why do you look at well-being and how it's done today and what's wrong about how it's done or has been
Mm.
done in the past, and then how you exactly improve the way people think about it or have investigated it. And maybe
Mhm.
that's like, so far we've only looked at income and you combine the different things and so on, but that was not super clear to me. And then it's also easier to have kind of an outlook of the presentation so I know what to expect, because I wasn't sure if some empirical stuff will still come or if that's like a theoretical discussion about
Mm.
well-being.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I'll include an outlook. Yeah.
And I think also, so two things. First, the number of people who are going to think this is controversial is probably limited to those who have some prior knowledge about well-being, right? And so I'm guessing that you're steeling yourself for one person, and it, rather than trying to speak to the whole audience who may just be curious and this is completely outside of their experience.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so don't put too much in for that one person, because then you're not serving the rest. The
Mm.
other thing is, I feel like, and I could be wrong, but I feel like you're still in a mode of showing your coolest graphs rather than telling a story. And I think
Mhm.
you're on the way to telling a story, but this is the point where you have to let go of things that you love for the sake of making it clear. Those things that you
Mm.
love will be in a paper somewhere, but they're not all going to fit in a 20-minute presentation.
Mm.
And so like that last thing with New York and the urban.
Oh, that is throwaway, definitely.
Just
I just
tell you this, right?
Yeah.
It's so tempting. Let me just tell you this cool thing. And when people have gone through 2 or 3 of them, they just check out, right? They just check out a last one, like, okay, yeah, you got some cool stuff. I get it. And so, but I like Narasimha's idea of just show how multifaceted it is, emphasize that this wasn't brought together before, and then just keep showing the facets. So then we observed that we could not discern this question. And so by bringing in this other data set, we were able to do this thing. And so it's like you just take one question and you keep looking at it in different ways.
Karthik, you did a great job, and so the well-being and presentation is a little vague for me. But I felt that the physical aspect of well-being is a little vague in your work. You have my voice? Yes?
Maybe a little louder, maybe.
Oh, let me change the. Oh, now you have my voice?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I actually have a question about the physical aspect of the well-being. It seems you didn't put much attention in your work about physical health and other aspects in.
Yeah, I mean, I have not done it, but we do have the variable of how people feel about their own health. So I think I will include that as well. I mean, that's a really valid point as well, because most of the frameworks talk about health in both, physical and mental terms. So yeah, I think I will try to include the physical part as well.
Wow, that's great. And also after COVID, people are more concerned about their mental health and other aspects in this kind of well-being studies. It would be good if we consider that. And your data set in Fusion, I consulted with that. All of them are almost back to 2019, and the COVID is after that. And now people perceive their well-being in another ways, are more concerned about their well-being.
I mean, that is a valid point. Yeah, all of our stuff is 2019, the one that I showed today. I mean, in theory, we could do other years and see, if how life satisfaction or stress maybe changed during this time. Right, because I mean, a lot of things have changed with COVID, right? Even, for example, online shopping. So maybe time to grocery store is not such a great indicator anymore because people tend to order online. But again, that might just be a small fraction, but yeah, there are valid criticisms of how relevant 2019 is, consider what happened after that. Yeah.
Oh, you did great job, and I should leave. I have another meeting. Bye.
Thanks, Sarah. All right.
Karthik, thanks, Christina, for joining. Really appreciate
Yeah,
this.
thanks. It was interesting
Yeah,
for me.
thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice for you to also know the other research we're doing, on this stuff.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah,
it's,
definitely. And I'll send you some more detailed comments later.
Oh, thank you.
that's wonderful. Karthik, I also have an 11 o'clock.
Yeah, let's meet at noon.
Let's meet at noon. Is that okay with you? We can discuss.
Yeah, that works.
We want to discuss something else, right? But we'll discuss this as well.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
have time, so
Sounds
we can
good.
go through whatever else we need.
Okay.
But really fascinating. It's amazing how far you've tried to take some of this stuff. Maybe you have to pull back a little bit and focus more, show more, rather than just the highlight graphs, just to explore. But it's super. I'm really excited about this. It raises so much in my mind, so many questions, It is an initial exploration. But yeah, we'll talk more about it at noon. And what else can I say? Christina, when do you want to chat? When you let us know when you're ready to chat.
Yeah, I will
Okay.
send you an email. Yeah.
Okay. Otherwise,
Yeah, Christina, I will
Oh,
respond to
yeah.
your email.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
I guess I want to tell Tammy something else, but she's gone. So okay, that's it. So we'll talk later.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks a lot. Bye,
All right.
Christina.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye
thanks
bye.
so much, Christina. Thanks, Christina. Bye.